Here is something worth sitting with before we go any further. Every major religious institution in history has claimed, at some point, that its sacred texts are beyond question, not just inspired, not just meaningful, beyond question. And yet, almost every one of those same institutions has also, at some point, done something extraordinarily telling. It has punished the people who asked questions. Not violent people, not criminals, scholars, careful readers, people who picked up the texts, read them slowly, and said, "Wait, does this actually match what happened?" That reaction, the punishment, the excommunication, the banning of books, the attempted murder, tells you something far more important than any theological argument ever could. When an institution responds to a question with violence, it is not defending truth. It is defending power. And power, unlike truth, cannot survive examination. That is where our investigation begins. Not with the prophecies themselves, but with the man who first dared to examine them systematically, and what happened to him when he did. His name was Baruch Spinoza, and he was born in 1632 Amsterdam, into a Portuguese Jewish community that had already suffered enormously for the crime of belief. His family had fled the Spanish Inquisition. They understood, in the most personal and visceral way imaginable, what religious institutions did to people who stepped outside the approved boundaries. And yet Spinoza, trained as a scholar, steeped in Hebrew, Aramaic, and the full body of rabbinic literature, made the mistake that his community feared most. He read carefully. He thought critically. He compared what the text claimed against what the historical record showed. He applied, in other words, the same basic investigative logic you would use to evaluate any claim made by any person in any other context. And in 1656, when he was just 23 years old, the synagogue elders of Amsterdam issued against him the harshest form of excommunication in Jewish tradition, the cherem. The language of that document is extraordinary. They cursed him by day and by night. They cursed him sleeping and waking. They ordered every member of the community to shun him completely. No conversation, no commerce, no proximity. His father had just died, and Spinoza was forbidden from attending the funeral. His family turned away from him. The community that had formed his entire world erased him from it. And the reason, stripped of all theological decoration, was this: he had suggested that the Bible was written by human beings, that its prophecies could be evaluated like any other historical claim, and that contradictions in Scripture were not sacred mysteries but problems worth investigating. For that, they wanted him gone. What followed reads less like religious history and more like a thriller. When excommunication failed to silence him, when Spinoza kept writing, kept publishing, kept reasoning, the persecution escalated. Christian authorities in Amsterdam joined the effort. There were attempts to have him arrested. An assassin approached him outside a theater and lunged at him with a knife. Spinoza survived, kept the torn coat as a reminder, and continued working. He spent the rest of his life grinding lenses to earn a living, because both the Jewish and Christian communities had made him unemployable in any respectable profession. And years of inhaling fine glass dust likely contributed to the lung disease that killed him at 44. He died in a rented room, largely alone, having been cut off from every institutional structure that normally sustains a human life. And yet, in that isolation, he produced something that religious authorities feared more than any army. He produced a method, published anonymously in 1670, because he knew what would happen if his name appeared on the cover. The Tractatus Theologico-Politicus laid out a systematic approach to analyzing sacred texts, not through faith, not through tradition, but through the same tools used to evaluate any historical document. Compare manuscripts. Examine when a text was actually written versus when it claims to have been written. Check whether a prophecy describes events that genuinely occurred afterward, or events that had already happened before the text was composed. Look at the specific language. Look at the context. Look at the timeline. And then ask the one question that destroys comfortable assumptions. Did this actually come true the way it was written? The book was banned almost immediately. Dutch authorities declared it blasphemous. The church ordered it burned. Readers caught with copies faced prosecution. The reaction was, again, completely disproportionate to what the book actually contained. It was scholarship. Careful. Documented. Logically coherent scholarship. The only thing that made it dangerous was that it worked. Here is what Spinoza found when he applied his method, and what we are going to trace across 9 specific cases in this investigation. Many of the prophecies that religious institutions have presented as proof of divine authorship are not what they are claimed to be. Some were already fulfilled in their own historical moment, and were later borrowed and reapplied to different events centuries later. Some made specific, testable predictions: cities destroyed, rivers dried up, kingdoms restored, timelines measured in decades, that history simply did not fulfill. Some contradict the very texts surrounding them, and some required such dramatic reinterpretation, such deliberate removal of context, such creative retranslation of key words, that calling them fulfilled requires abandoning the plain meaning of language altogether. This is not a matter of faith versus doubt. It is a matter of reading carefully versus not reading at all. Spinoza read carefully. He paid for it with everything he had: his community, his family, his safety, eventually his life. But what he left behind is a lens. And once you look through it, the landscape of these prophetic texts changes permanently. The 9 cases ahead are not fringe examples cherry-picked from obscure corners of Scripture. They are the central, frequently cited, publicly celebrated prophecies that fill sermons, apologetics books, and documentary films. The ones your pastor references, the ones used in debates to argue for divine authorship. They are the strongest examples the institution offers. And they are the ones that fail most visibly when you do what Spinoza did. When you actually open any list of fulfilled biblical prophecies produced by a Christian apologist, and you will almost certainly find Tyre near the top. It is presented as one of the crown jewels, a prediction so specific, so detailed, so dramatically verified by subsequent history that it practically demands a supernatural explanation. The city of Tyre, the argument goes, was condemned by the prophet Ezekiel around 586 BC, and everything Ezekiel said would happen to it eventually came true. Skeptics are invited to marvel at the precision. They are pointed to archaeology, to Alexander the Great, to the causeway built across the water. What they are almost never shown is Ezekiel chapter 29, where the Bible quietly, almost apologetically, admits that the central prediction failed. That admission, sitting in plain sight, just a few pages away from the original prophecy, is one of the most remarkable moments of self-correction in the entire biblical text, and it has been systematically ignored for centuries. So let us open the actual case file and read what the prophet wrote, what history recorded, and what the evidence genuinely shows. The prophecy appears in Ezekiel chapter 26, and it is striking in its specificity. Speaking in the voice of God, Ezekiel names a precise agent of destruction, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. The prediction is not vague. It does not say Tyre will face difficulties, or that its enemies will grow strong, or that judgment is coming in some undefined form. It says Nebuchadnezzar will come against Tyre with horses, chariots, and an army. He will destroy its walls, break down its towers, scrape away its soil, and make it a bare rock. The city will be thrown into the sea. Its stones, its timber, its very soil will be cast into the water. It will become a place for the spreading of fishing nets. It will never be rebuilt. The nations will be appalled. It will be gone forever. These are falsifiable claims. They name a specific conqueror, describe a specific outcome, and point toward a specific and permanent result. This is exactly the kind of prophecy that should be easy to verify. And when you verify it, the result is unambiguous. Nebuchadnezzar did besiege Tyre. He arrived around 586 BC and maintained that siege for 13 years. 13 years is an extraordinary military commitment. And yet, at the end of it, the city had not fallen. Tyre sat on an island just off the Phoenician coast, and Babylon possessed no meaningful naval capability. The Tyrians simply resupplied by sea and waited. Eventually, Nebuchadnezzar negotiated a treaty and withdrew. The city he was specifically prophesied to destroy had survived him entirely. Now here is the detail that apologists almost never address directly. Ezekiel knew this. The prophet, or at minimum the tradition that preserved and edited these texts, was aware that Nebuchadnezzar had not destroyed Tyre as predicted. And so in chapter 29, a correction appears. God tells Ezekiel that Nebuchadnezzar and his army received no reward from their campaign against Tyre. No plunder. No conquest. Nothing to compensate for the labor they had invested. Therefore, God says, He will give them Egypt instead. Read that slowly. The text is explaining why Nebuchadnezzar is being given a different prize. Because the original prize, the destruction and looting of Tyre, did not happen. This is not ambiguous. This is the Bible acknowledging, in its own language, that the prophecy of Ezekiel 26 was not fulfilled by Nebuchadnezzar. The named conqueror did not accomplish what he was named to accomplish. Apologists at this point typically pivot to Alexander the Great, who did conquer Tyre in 332 BC. Roughly 250 years after Ezekiel wrote, Alexander built a causeway from the mainland to the island, using rubble from the old coastal settlement, crossed it with his army, and took the city after a 7-month siege. Portions of that old rubble went into the sea, which apologists point to as the fulfillment of Ezekiel's image of stones and timber cast into the water. But this argument collapses under the weight of what the prophecy actually says. Ezekiel did not predict an unnamed conqueror arriving 2.5 centuries later. He named Nebuchadnezzar specifically. He described Nebuchadnezzar's army: horses, chariots, the machinery of Babylonian warfare, as the instrument of destruction. And he said the city would be destroyed permanently, left as bare rock, never to be rebuilt. Alexander did not permanently destroy Tyre. He conquered it, punished it harshly, and moved on. The city was rebuilt. It thrived under the Seleucids, the Romans, the Byzantines, and the Crusaders. The New Testament records Jesus traveling through the region of Tyre. The Apostle Paul stopped there during his missionary journeys and spent a week with the Christian community that had established itself in the city. A city that was supposed to be bare rock, uninhabited, cast into the sea, hosting a functioning Christian congregation during Paul's lifetime. Today, the city is called Sour. It sits in southern Lebanon. Its population exceeds 100,000 people. You can book a flight, land in Beirut, drive south, and walk through it. There are restaurants, schools, a harbor, archaeological ruins that tourists photograph, and a living community that has existed continuously for millennia. The bare rock, where fishermen were supposed to spread their nets, is a city. What does this tell us? Beyond the obvious point that the prophecy failed, it reveals something important about how prophecy functions psychologically and sociologically. Researchers who study prediction and belief, particularly the work following Leon Festinger's foundational studies on cognitive dissonance, have consistently found that humans do not typically abandon a belief when evidence contradicts it. They reinterpret the evidence. They adjust the timeline. They find partial matches and treat them as complete fulfillments. They shift the goalposts so gradually that the movement becomes invisible. The Tyre prophecy is a textbook demonstration of this process, stretched across 2,000 years of theological creativity. A named conqueror failed. A different conqueror arrived centuries later and achieved partial results. The city was never permanently destroyed. And yet the prophecy is still listed in countless apologetics resources as verified and fulfilled. The gap between what the text says and what actually happened is not subtle. It is the gap between a bare rock in the Mediterranean and a Lebanese city of 100,000 people. That gap does not close through interpretation. It only disappears if you stop reading carefully. Spinoza read carefully, and the city of Tyre is still standing. There is one more dimension of this case worth examining before we move on, because it speaks directly to the method religious institutions use to protect failed predictions from scrutiny. When confronted with the evidence, the surviving city, the biblical retraction in chapter 29, the mismatch between the named conqueror and the actual conqueror, apologists frequently introduce what theologians call a dual fulfillment framework. The idea is that some prophecies have an immediate, partial fulfillment and a future, complete fulfillment yet to come. Under this reading, Alexander partially fulfilled Ezekiel's words, and some future event will complete them. But notice what this framework actually does. It makes the prophecy permanently unfalsifiable. Any prediction, no matter how specifically worded, no matter how clearly tied to a named agent and a defined outcome, can be protected from failure by simply declaring that the real fulfillment is still coming. This is not a theological insight. It is a logical escape hatch, and it was not invented as a tool of honest interpretation. It was invented as a tool of institutional defense, a way to preserve the credibility of prophetic texts when the events they predicted did not materialize on schedule. Ezekiel named Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar failed. The city survived, thrived, and exists today. The prophecy failed. Everything else is explanation built around that failure. There is a particular kind of intellectual courage required to double down after you have already been wrong once. Most people, when their first prediction fails, quietly move on. They find new territory, vaguer language, softer claims. But Ezekiel did something different, having just produced a prophecy about Tyre that the biblical text itself would later quietly acknowledge did not unfold as written. The prophet pivoted, in the very next chapter, to an even more specific, even more testable prediction, this time about Egypt. And this time, crucially, he attached a number, not a vague promise of judgment, not a metaphor about divine displeasure, a number. 40 years, a defined period of total desolation, complete abandonment, not a single human footprint, not a single animal crossing the land. If Tyre was the prophecy that failed with ambiguity around it, Egypt is the prophecy that failed in the open, with a timestamp attached, against one of the most thoroughly documented civilizations in human history. The fact that this prediction is not discussed in apologetics nearly as often as the Tyre prophecy is itself informative. The less defensible a failure is, the quieter the institution becomes about it. The specific text is Ezekiel chapter 29, verses 8 through 12, and the language leaves almost no room for flexible interpretation. God declares that Egypt will be made utterly desolate. The land will be laid waste. No human foot will pass through it. No animal foot will touch it. For 40 years, the country will be completely empty, a wasteland without inhabitants. Then, after those 40 years, God will gather the scattered Egyptians from wherever they have been dispersed and bring them back. But Egypt will return diminished. It will become, God says, the lowliest of kingdoms and will never again exalt itself above the nations. The precision here is striking. 40 years. No humans. No animals. Complete dispersal of the population, followed by a specific restoration to a permanently reduced status. This is not poetry. This is not metaphor inviting symbolic reading. This is a factual claim about a geographically specific country across a measurable period of time. And we have extraordinarily detailed records of Egypt during precisely the period when this was supposed to occur. Egyptian administrative documents, Greek historical accounts, Persian imperial records, and an unbroken archaeological record of continuous urban occupation all tell the same story. Egypt was never abandoned. Its cities were never emptied. The Nile Valley was never left without human presence for 40 years. For 4 years. For 4 months. Or for any meaningful period at all. Here is what the historical record actually shows. Nebuchadnezzar did campaign against Egypt around 568 BC, roughly the same period during which Ezekiel was writing. The Babylonian incursion was real but limited. There was no mass deportation of the Egyptian population. There was no transformation of the Nile Delta into an uninhabited wasteland. Egypt continued functioning as a political and economic entity. When the Persians under Cambyses conquered Egypt in 525 BC, they found a fully inhabited, administratively functioning country, not a recovering wilderness, slowly repopulating after 4 decades of emptiness. They established Egypt as a Persian province called a satrapy, collected taxes from its cities, and left detailed records of the transactions. Greek historians, including Herodotus, who visited Egypt in the 5th century BC, described a living, populated civilization with functioning temples, active agricultural systems, and a continuous cultural identity stretching back thousands of years. There is no gap in this record. There is no 40-year silence. There is no archaeological layer representing a period of abandonment followed by resettlement. The prophecy demanded a historical event of enormous civilization-scale magnitude, the complete emptying of one of the ancient world's most densely populated regions, and that event simply did not happen. Scholars who have examined this prophecy carefully, including those working within religious traditions, generally acknowledge the difficulty. The most honest among them admit that no historical period can be identified that corresponds to what Ezekiel described. The standard apologetic response is to argue that Nebuchadnezzar's campaign constituted a partial fulfillment, or that the 40 years should be understood symbolically. But 40 years is 40 years. The text does not say approximately 40 years, or a long season of judgment, or a period symbolically equivalent to a generation. It says 40 years of complete desolation with no human or animal presence. That is a falsifiable claim. History has falsified it. Now consider what happens when we move from Ezekiel's Egypt prophecy to Isaiah's prediction about the Nile. If anything, this second case is even more straightforward, because it concerns not a human population that could theoretically be dispersed and resettled, but a river. Rivers do not relocate voluntarily. They do not respond to prophetic decree. They follow terrain, rainfall, and hydrology. And the Nile, specifically, is one of the most consistent, most studied, most historically documented river systems on the entire planet. Isaiah chapter 19, verses 5 through 8, states plainly that the waters of the Nile will dry up, the river will be parched and drained, the reeds and rushes along its banks will wither, everything planted along the Nile will shrivel, fishermen will mourn because there are no fish, everyone who works the river will be in despair. Has the Nile ever dried up? Not once in recorded human history. Ancient Egyptian civilization was built on the absolute dependability of the Nile's annual cycle, the flooding season, the recession, the planting season. The entire agricultural calendar that sustained one of history's greatest civilizations was synchronized to a river that arrived with extraordinary regularity. Year after year, millennium after millennium, Greek and Roman writers documented the Nile in detail. Egyptian priests tracked its flood levels for thousands of years and left those records inscribed in stone. There is no year missing from the record. There is no season where the sources dry up, and scribes note with astonishment that the river has vanished. Because the river did not vanish. It flows today with the same fundamental consistency it has always maintained. Now partially managed by the Aswan High Dam, but never, at any point in history, absent. When apologists encounter this prophecy, the most common response is to categorize it as poetic or symbolic language, a vivid metaphor for Egypt's economic collapse rather than a literal hydrological prediction. But read the context. Isaiah is making consecutive specific predictions about Egypt's agricultural and economic systems collapsing in sequence. He describes the linen workers, the weavers, the fishermen, specific industries tied to specific geographic realities. This is not the language of abstract poetry. It is the language of prophetic specificity, the same register used in Ezekiel's Egypt and Tyre predictions, and prophecy that is specific when it seems impressive but suddenly becomes metaphorical when it fails, is not a reliable guide to anything except the flexibility of motivated interpretation. The Nile still flows. Egypt was never desolate for 40 years. The pattern that began with Tyre is solidifying into something systematic. What makes these three cases, Tyre, Egypt, and the Nile, particularly significant when examined together is not just that they failed individually, but that they failed as a cluster produced by the same prophetic tradition within a relatively short period. Spinoza's method, applied rigorously, reveals something that random error alone cannot explain. These predictions share a common geographical focus on regions that were politically relevant to ancient Israel and Judah during the Babylonian crisis. They share a common rhetorical structure, the announcement of divine judgment against foreign powers. And they share a common fate. None of them materialized in the form described. What this pattern suggests to historians who study the development of prophetic literature is that these texts were not transcriptions of divine foreknowledge. They were political and theological responses to immediate historical crises, written in the confident language of divine authority, precisely because that language carried institutional weight. When the predicted events failed to materialize, the texts were preserved anyway, because discarding them would mean discarding the prophetic authority that undergirded the entire institutional structure. So they were kept, and explanations were built around them. And centuries of theological creativity were devoted to making the gap between prediction and reality invisible to ordinary readers who trusted their teachers not to mislead them. The gap was never invisible. It was just carefully managed. There is a technique in argumentation called context stripping. And once you learn to recognize it, you see it everywhere. It works like this. You take a statement made in a specific situation, for a specific audience, addressing a specific problem, and you lift one sentence out of it. You present that sentence in isolation. You apply it to an entirely different situation, a different audience, a different problem, and then you declare that the original speaker was prophetically anticipating your new context all along. Done skillfully. Context stripping can make almost any text predict almost anything. A speech about agricultural policy can be made to predict an economic crisis. A poem about personal grief can be made to anticipate a national tragedy. The technique does not require dishonesty in its most obvious form. It requires only the willingness to stop reading when the surrounding context becomes inconvenient. The fourth case in our investigation is perhaps the clearest example of context stripping in the entire biblical prophetic tradition, and it involves a grieving mother, a Babylonian exile, and a gospel writer who needed a prophecy badly enough to take one that was already finished. Jeremiah chapter 31, verses 15 through 17, is a passage of genuine emotional power. The prophet describes Rachel, the matriarch, the symbolic mother of the northern Israelite tribes, weeping inconsolably for her children. Her descendants have been taken into Babylonian exile. They are gone, scattered, seemingly lost. But then God speaks directly into that grief. Stop weeping. The passage says, your work will be rewarded. Your children will return from the land of the enemy. There is hope for your future. They will come back to their own land. This is the complete prophetic unit. It has a clear historical context. The Babylonian exile of the 6th century BC. It has a clear audience. The exiled Israelite community. It has a clear promise. Return from captivity. And crucially, it has a clear fulfillment. The exiles did return. Under Cyrus of Persia, beginning around 538 BC, Jewish communities were permitted to go back to their homeland. The prophecy worked exactly as written, for exactly the people it was written to address. It was finished, complete, historically resolved. Matthew's gospel then reaches back to verse 15 of this passage, just that one verse, the image of Rachel weeping, and applies it to Herod's massacre of infant boys in Bethlehem following the birth of Jesus. A voice is heard in Ramah. Matthew writes, weeping and great mourning. Rachel weeping for her children. Matthew presents this as prophetic fulfillment. But notice what has been done. The verse about weeping has been extracted from a passage whose entire point is that the weeping will end and the children will return. The comfort, the promise, the resolution, all of it is gone. What remains is one image of grief, relocated centuries forward, attached to a completely different event. The surrounding context, which already contains its own fulfillment, has been discarded entirely. This is not interpretation. This is amputation. You cannot honestly claim a prophecy is fulfilled by an event while ignoring that the same prophecy was already fulfilled by a different event in its own historical moment. But the problems with this particular case go deeper than methodology. Because the event Matthew applies the prophecy to, Herod's massacre of infant boys in Bethlehem, the so-called massacre of the innocents, almost certainly did not happen. This is not a fringe scholarly position. It is the mainstream historical assessment, and the reasoning behind it is straightforward. Flavius Josephus, the first-century Jewish historian, documented the reign of Herod the Great in extraordinary detail. Josephus was not writing to protect Herod's reputation. He catalogued executions, paranoid purges, the murder of Herod's own sons, the killing of his wife, the slaughter of rival claimants to power. Josephus had both the access and the motivation to record every atrocity Herod committed, and his account of Herod's reign is among the most detailed portraits of any ancient ruler that survives. The massacre of every infant boy in and around Bethlehem, an act that would have generated enormous grief, regional outcry, and lasting communal memory, appears nowhere in Josephus. It appears in no Roman record. It appears in no contemporary Jewish source outside of Matthew's Gospel. Historians who study Herodian Judea have consistently noted this absence as significant. The argument from silence is not always conclusive in historical research. But when the silence comes from a source as thorough and as motivated to record Herodian atrocities as Josephus, it carries considerable weight. The most plausible scholarly explanation for the massacre story is that Matthew constructed it deliberately as a parallel to the birth narrative of Moses, who also survived an infanticide decree issued by a foreign ruler. The literary and theological symmetry between the Moses story and Matthew's Jesus narrative is too precise and too extensive to be coincidental. Matthew was writing for a Jewish audience steeped in the Torah, and presenting Jesus as a new Moses required a new Pharaoh and a new infanticide. Herod provided the Pharaoh. The massacre provided the infanticide. The prophecy from Jeremiah provided the scriptural anchor. The result is a layered construction in which a prophecy already fulfilled in its own context is misapplied to an event that the historical record strongly suggests was invented to create a theological parallel. That is a double failure of remarkable completeness. The fifth case shifts from misappropriated prophecy to something even more fundamental, a divine decree that the biblical text itself immediately contradicts. Genesis chapter 6. Verse 3 contains a statement attributed directly to God. His spirit will not contend with humanity forever. For humans are mortal, and their days will be 120 years. Straightforward enough on the surface. God is setting a limit, 120 years. The question is, what kind of limit? And the answer is that neither available interpretation survives contact with the surrounding text. The first interpretation is that God is announcing a countdown, 120 years until the flood that will cleanse the earth. But Genesis itself makes this arithmetic impossible. The statement is made when Noah is approximately 500 years old. Noah is 600 years old when the flood arrives. That is a gap of 100 years, not 120. The countdown interpretation fails on its own timeline before the next chapter begins. The second interpretation is that God is establishing a maximum human lifespan of 120 years going forward. This reading has been popular in certain theological traditions, and it seems initially more defensible. But open the text a few pages further, and the contradiction becomes spectacular. Noah, the man standing closest to God during this entire episode, lives to be 950 years old. Abraham reaches 175. Isaac lives to 180. Jacob dies at 147. These are not obscure minor figures living in the margins of the narrative. They are the central patriarchs of the tradition, living centuries past the limit God supposedly established in Genesis 6. The decree, if it means anything as a maximum lifespan, is violated repeatedly and immediately by the very heroes of the story. And in the modern verified record, Jeanne Calment of France lived to 122 years, surpassing the supposed divine ceiling with documentation precise enough to satisfy any historian. A prophecy, or divine decree, that is broken by the text surrounding it and by verified contemporary human experience is not a mystery requiring deeper theological sensitivity. It is a contradiction, and contradictions, as Spinoza observed with characteristic precision, are not sacred. They are informative. What connects these two cases? The misappropriated Rachel passage and the broken Genesis decree is that both reveal something about the nature of the texts themselves that institutional religion has worked very hard to keep invisible. These are not seamlessly consistent documents produced by a single omniscient author. They are composite texts, assembled across centuries, by communities with different concerns, different theologies, and different relationships to the historical events they describe. When Matthew reaches back into Jeremiah for a verse to anchor his birth narrative, he is doing what ancient writers regularly did, drawing on authoritative tradition to legitimize new claims. When Genesis records a divine decree that its own genealogies immediately contradict, it is preserving two traditions that were never fully harmonized. None of this is surprising to historians of ancient literature. What is surprising, or rather, what becomes impossible to sustain once you look carefully, is the claim that these texts are the product of perfect divine dictation, free from human error, capable of predicting the future with precision that proves supernatural authorship, prophecies that were already fulfilled before they were borrowed, decrees that the surrounding text contradicts on the same page. These are not the fingerprints of omniscience. They are the fingerprints of very human writers doing their very human best with the traditions, the anxieties, and the political pressures of their particular historical moment. If you were to rank the prophecies most frequently cited as proof of biblical divine authorship, Isaiah chapter 7 verse 14 would sit near the very top of almost every list. It is the foundation of the Christian virgin birth narrative. It is quoted in Christmas sermons, printed on greeting cards, and presented in apologetics debates as one of the clearest examples of supernatural foreknowledge in the entire scriptural tradition. A prediction made 700 years before its fulfillment, naming the miraculous circumstances of the Messiah's birth with a precision that could only be explained by divine revelation. The problem with this picture is not subtle. It does not require advanced scholarship to identify. It requires only what Spinoza consistently demanded and what religious institutions have consistently discouraged: reading the whole passage, in its original language, in its original context, with attention to who is speaking, who is listening, and what specific problem is being addressed in the moment the words are spoken. When you do that, the virgin birth prophecy does not look like a 700-year forecast. It looks like a piece of immediate political reassurance delivered to a terrified king who needed comfort right then. In the 8th century BC, not at some distant point, his grandchildren's grandchildren would never live to see. The scene in Isaiah chapter 7 is historically specific and dramatically vivid. The year is approximately 735 BC. King Ahaz of Judah is facing a genuine military crisis. Two neighboring kingdoms, Israel to the north, under King Pekah, and Syria, under King Rezin, have formed an alliance and are marching against Jerusalem. The biblical text describes Ahaz and his people as trembling with fear, their hearts shaking like trees in the wind. Into this crisis steps the prophet Isaiah, sent by God to deliver a message of reassurance. Do not fear. Isaiah tells the king, "These two kings threatening you are nothing but smoldering stumps. They will not succeed." Then God, through Isaiah, offers Ahaz something remarkable, an invitation to ask for any sign, any confirmation of the divine promise, as dramatic or as extraordinary as he wishes. Ahaz refuses, claiming piety. He will not test God. Isaiah responds with visible frustration. "Fine," he says, "the Lord will give you a sign anyway." And then comes the verse that has been extracted, repackaged, and presented to billions of people as a prediction of Jesus. A young woman is pregnant and will give birth to a son. and she will call his name Emmanuel. Before this child knows enough to reject evil and choose good. The land of the two kings you dread will be laid waste. Read that carefully. The sign is for Ahaz. It is being given to address his specific military crisis. It has an explicit timeline. Before the child reaches an age of moral discernment, the two threatening kings will be gone. A sign with a fulfillment horizon of 700 years is not a sign to the person receiving it. It is useless to Ahaz. It offers him no reassurance about the invasion he is facing today. This season, with enemy armies already in motion toward his city, the entire logic of the passage requires a near-term fulfillment. The sign has to be meaningful to its recipient. And it was. Within a few years of Isaiah's declaration, both Pekah and Rezin were dead. Pekah assassinated by a rival. Rezin killed by the Assyrians. The threat evaporated exactly as the sign promised. The prophecy functioned precisely as intended. For precisely the audience it was intended to address. It was already done. The mechanism by which this finished, historically resolved prophecy, was transformed into a prediction of Jesus, begins with a single word, and a translation made several centuries after Isaiah wrote. The Hebrew text uses the word Alma to describe the woman who will give birth. Alma means young woman. It carries no intrinsic implication of virginity. Hebrew has a separate word, Betula, that more specifically denotes a virgin, and Isaiah did not use it. When Jewish scholars in Alexandria translated the Hebrew scriptures into Greek in the centuries before the Common Era, producing the translation known as the Septuagint, they rendered Alma as Parthenos. Parthenos in Greek can mean virgin, though it can also mean simply a young woman of marriageable age. This translation choice, made for reasons that may have been entirely innocent, created a textual bridge that Matthew's Gospel later crossed. Writing in Greek for a Greek reading audience, drawing on the Greek Septuagint rather than the original Hebrew, Matthew encountered Parthenos and built his birth narrative around it. The mistranslation was not necessarily deliberate at the Septuagint stage, but by the time Matthew was writing, the theological need for a virgin birth prophecy was acute enough that the Greek rendering was treated as settled. The Hebrew original was set aside, and the contextual framework, the terrified king, the immediate military crisis, the near-term fulfillment horizon, was simply not mentioned. What remained was a single verse, stripped of everything that explained it, presented as a timeless prediction of a miraculous birth that would occur 7 centuries in the future. The substitution of one word in one language for one word in another language, across several centuries of translation and theological development, became the foundation of one of Christianity's most central doctrines. That is an enormous amount of weight for a single translation choice to bear. There is one additional problem with the Matthew application of this prophecy, and it is so direct, so plainly visible in the text, that it is genuinely surprising how rarely it is discussed in mainstream apologetics. The prophecy in Isaiah does not just describe a miraculous birth. It names the child. The child will be called Emmanuel. That name is not incidental. It is the sign. The name itself, meaning God with us, is presented as the divine confirmation that God is present with Ahaz and with Judah in their moment of crisis. The child's name is the message. Now, Jesus was not named Emmanuel. He was named Jesus, a form of the Hebrew name Yeshua, meaning God saves or the Lord is salvation. These are different names with different meanings. Matthew acknowledges the name Emmanuel in his account, noting that the name means God with us. But he applies it to Jesus as a kind of title or theological description rather than an actual name. The prophecy, however, does not say the child will have a name that could be interpreted as thematically similar to Emmanuel. It says his name will be Emmanuel. If Isaiah was predicting Jesus with the specificity that apologists claim, the child should have been named Emmanuel. He was not. The fulfillment fails on its own explicit terms, a prophecy that names the wrong conqueror, as we saw with Tyre, has failed. A prophecy whose named child carries a different name than the person claimed to fulfill it has also failed. The pattern is consistent. The details, when examined carefully, do not match. And the details are precisely what prophetic specificity is supposed to get right, what the Isaiah chapter 7 case ultimately reveals, when examined with full attention to its linguistic, historical, and contextual dimensions, is a process that biblical scholars have documented extensively across the New Testament, a practice called pesher interpretation, or sometimes typological reading. Ancient Jewish writers, including the authors of the Dead Sea Scrolls, regularly read earlier scriptures as containing hidden layers of meaning applicable to their own present circumstances. Matthew was working within a recognizable literary tradition when he reached back into the Hebrew prophets and found images, verses, and phrases that resonated with the Jesus story he was telling. The difference between legitimate typological reading and prophetic fabrication lies in what claims are made about the original text. If Matthew had said, "Here is an ancient image that illuminates something about Jesus in a spiritually suggestive way," no serious historical objection arises. Ancient literature is full of resonances across time, and finding them is a legitimate literary activity. But the claim being made is far stronger than that. The claim is that Isaiah was receiving supernatural information about a specific future event and encoding it in prophecy, that divine foreknowledge produced the text. And the text proves divine foreknowledge. That circular claim requires the prophecy to actually match the event it supposedly predicts. And when you examine the language, the context, the timeline, the name, and the historical fulfillment that already occurred in the 8th century BC, the match dissolves. What remains is a powerful ancient text about a king's fear and a prophet's reassurance, which has been doing extraordinary theological work for 2,000 years in a role it was never written to fill. There is something almost elegant about the way confirmation bias operates at a civilizational scale. An entire culture reads a text expecting to find predictions of its founding figure. And lo, predictions appear everywhere. Verses that were written about Assyrian military campaigns become birth announcements. Passages consoling exiled communities become infancy narratives. The expectation does not falsify the reading deliberately or dishonestly. It simply filters perception so completely that contradictory information never quite registers with the same sharpness as confirming information. Psychologists call this selective attention. Historians call it anachronistic reading. And when applied to the Micah chapter 5 prophecy about Bethlehem, it produces one of the most thoroughly examined and most thoroughly misrepresented cases in the entire debate about biblical prophecy. The story appears simple on the surface. Micah predicts Bethlehem. Jesus is born in Bethlehem. Prophecy fulfilled. But underneath that apparently clean narrative lie two separate historical problems. One about what Micah actually predicted, and one about whether Jesus was actually born in Bethlehem at all. Both problems are serious. Together, they dismantle the fulfillment claim entirely. Start with what Micah chapter 5 actually says, because the context surrounding the famous verse is almost never quoted in apologetics presentations. And the reason for that omission becomes immediately obvious when you read it. Verse 2. The celebrated passage identifies Bethlehem Ephrathah as the origin point of a coming ruler whose origins are ancient. Christians point to this as a prediction of the Messiah's birthplace. But verse 5 of the same chapter, just 3 verses later, explicitly identifies what this ruler is supposed to accomplish. The text says this person will be their peace when the Assyrians invade the land. When the Assyrians march through their borders, this ruler will raise against them 7 shepherds, even 8 commanders. He will deliver Israel from Assyrian domination. This is not a description of a spiritual savior arriving in the 1st century of the Common Era. This is a description of a military deliverer responding to the Assyrian imperial threat of the 8th century BC, the same historical crisis that dominated the entire prophetic period of Isaiah. Micah and their contemporaries. The Assyrian Empire had already collapsed long before Jesus was born, falling definitively to the Babylonians in 612 BC, roughly 6 centuries before the birth narratives of Matthew and Luke were composed. Jesus did not raise 8 commanders against Assyrian invaders. He could not have, because Assyria as a military power no longer existed during his lifetime. The prophecy in Micah was addressing a crisis that belonged entirely to Micah's own historical moment. And the ruler it describes was expected to resolve that crisis within a recognizable historical timeframe. Not arrive 6 centuries after the threat had dissolved into ancient history. Now, add the second layer of the problem. Even setting aside what Micah actually predicted, the claim that Jesus was born in Bethlehem rests on a foundation that historical examination does not support. The 2 gospel accounts that mention Bethlehem as a birthplace, Matthew and Luke, tell stories that contradict each other in significant and irreconcilable ways. And one of them requires a historical event that Roman records suggest did not occur as described. Matthew's gospel presents Mary and Joseph as Bethlehem residents. They are already there. The birth happens in their hometown. The Magi visit. And only after the danger from Herod forces them to flee do they eventually end up settling in Nazareth. Luke's gospel tells a completely different story. Mary and Joseph live in Nazareth. They travel to Bethlehem because of a Roman census requiring registration in the town of one's ancestral origin. The baby is born during this journey. The family returns to Nazareth after completing the required religious rituals in Jerusalem. These are not 2 accounts that differ in minor atmospheric details. They describe different domestic situations, different reasons for being in Bethlehem, and different subsequent movements of the family. They cannot both be historically accurate, because they contradict each other on points of basic geography and motivation. But the deeper problem belongs specifically to Luke, because the census mechanism he describes, requiring people to travel to the town of their distant ancestor for registration purposes, does not correspond to how Roman censuses actually functioned. Roman census procedures in the provinces were designed to assess taxable property and population for administrative purposes. You registered where you lived, where you owned property, where you conducted your economic life, requiring every subject of the empire to travel to the birthplace of an ancestor who may have lived 1,000 years earlier, would have created administrative chaos on an enormous scale, emptying cities of their working populations and clogging roads across the entire imperial territory simultaneously. No Roman administrative document, no historical account from the period, and no scholarly reconstruction of Roman census practice supports the mechanism Luke describes. The census that moves Mary and Joseph from Nazareth to Bethlehem appears, on historical examination, to be a narrative device rather than a recorded fact, a mechanism invented to solve a geographical problem. The problem being solved is precisely this. Jesus was known throughout his ministry as Jesus of Nazareth. Every gospel refers to him by this designation. His followers knew him as a Galilean, a Nazarene. But the prophecy, or what had been identified as a prophecy, pointed to Bethlehem. Someone had to get him there. Luke's census gets him there. But the census, as described, did not work the way Luke describes it working. What the Bethlehem case reveals, when examined with the same investigative attention we have applied to every other prophecy in this series, is the difference between history and theology operating at the point of composition. The gospel writers were not journalists recording events with neutral attention to factual accuracy. They were theologians constructing narratives with deep literary and doctrinal intentions, drawing on the Hebrew prophetic tradition to demonstrate that Jesus was the fulfillment of Israel's story. That project sometimes required placing Jesus in locations the historical record associated with prophetic significance. Bethlehem was one such location. The mechanism for getting him there, in Luke's case, required a census procedure that did not match Roman administrative reality. The alternative birth narrative in Matthew required a family residence in Bethlehem that Luke's account directly contradicts. And the prophecy itself, as we have seen, was not about the Messiah's birthplace at all. It was about a military deliverer rising against an empire that had ceased to exist 6 centuries before Jesus drew his first breath. Confirmation bias, operating across communities of sincere and often brilliant people over many generations, can produce readings of extraordinary sophistication and emotional power. What it cannot produce is a match between a prophecy and its claimed fulfillment when the prophecy was written about something else entirely, when the historical record of the fulfillment event is internally contradictory, and when one of its central mechanisms requires a Roman administrative practice that did not exist Sophistication of interpretation is not the same thing as accuracy of interpretation. And accuracy, in the end, is what a prophecy is supposed to demonstrate. There is one final observation about the Bethlehem case that deserves explicit attention because it speaks directly to the sociology of prophetic belief. Throughout his adult ministry, as documented across all four Gospels, Jesus is called by one geographical identifier with remarkable consistency. Not Jesus of Bethlehem, not Jesus, the Judean, Jesus of Nazareth. His disciples call him this. His opponents call him this. The inscription above the cross in John's Gospel reads, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. The community that formed around him after his death identified with Galilee, with the north, with a regional identity centered on Nazareth. If Jesus had genuinely been born in Bethlehem, in circumstances as dramatic as those described in either Matthew or Luke, angelic announcements, visiting magi, bearing royal gifts, or a census journey culminating in a manger birth witnessed by shepherds, it seems remarkable that none of the communities that preserved his memory chose to identify him by that birthplace. The geographical identity that stuck, across every independent tradition, was Nazareth. That is where his family was rooted. That is where he grew up. That is the place his contemporaries associated with him. The Bethlehem connection appears precisely where the theological need for it appears, in texts constructed to demonstrate prophetic fulfillment. Outside of those texts, the man from Nazareth remains, consistently and persistently. The man from Nazareth. Numbers are the enemy of vague prophecy. The moment a prophetic text attaches a specific number to a specific promise, it has done something irreversible. It has made itself testable. It has handed the reader a measuring instrument and invited comparison between the prediction and the historical record. Most failed prophecies survive through vagueness. They use language elastic enough to stretch across multiple events, multiple centuries, multiple interpretations. But Jeremiah was not vague. In chapter 25 and again in chapter 29, the prophet attached a number to one of the most consequential promises in the entire Hebrew prophetic tradition. 70 years. Not a generation. Not a long season. Not an extended period of divine discipline. 70 years. Stated twice. In two separate passages. With the same specific promise attached to both instances. When 70 years are completed, God tells the exiled community, I will come to you and fulfill my good promise to bring you back to this place. The restoration of Judah, the return from Babylonian captivity, the re-establishment of the covenant community in its homeland. All of it anchored to a precise numerical countdown. And what happened when that countdown expired is one of the most instructive stories in the history of prophetic interpretation. Because what happened was simultaneously a partial success and a significant failure. And the tradition has spent roughly 2.5 millennia making sure you only notice the success. The historical background is essential. In 586 BC, the Babylonian army under Nebuchadnezzar breached the walls of Jerusalem, destroyed the temple Solomon had built, and carried the Judean leadership, priesthood, and skilled population into exile in Babylon. This was not a minor military setback. It was a civilizational trauma of the first order, the destruction of the sacred center, the removal of the covenant community from the land God had promised them, the apparent abandonment of everything the prophets had said God would protect. Into that trauma, Jeremiah spoke with striking specificity. The exile would last 70 years, then restoration would come, then the kingdom would be returned. The number was not arbitrary. 70 years represented approximately a human lifetime, long enough to be a genuine punishment, short enough to offer genuine hope to people who might live to see its end. And the arithmetic of the fulfillment, measured from 586 BC, points to approximately 516 BC as the completion point. In 539 BC, Cyrus the Great of Persia conquered Babylon and issued what historians call the Cyrus Cylinder Decree, permitting displaced peoples throughout the former Babylonian Empire to return to their homelands and rebuild their temples. Jewish exiles began returning to Judah. The Second Temple was completed and dedicated in 516 BC, which falls remarkably close to 70 years after the destruction of the first. Apologists present this alignment as proof of prophetic fulfillment. And on the surface, the timeline does appear to work. The exile lasted roughly the predicted duration. Communities did return. The temple was rebuilt. If you stop the analysis at this point, the prophecy looks successful. But stopping the analysis at this point requires ignoring the most important part of what Jeremiah actually promised. The prophecy was not simply about the duration of the exile. It was not simply about the physical return of Jewish communities to the land of Judah. It was about the restoration of the kingdom. Jeremiah chapter 29 verse 10 does not say that after 70 years, some exiles will be permitted to return and rebuild a temple under Persian supervision. It says God will fulfill his good promise. A promise that the surrounding prophetic tradition makes unmistakably clear involves the re-establishment of Davidic kingship, the restoration of national sovereignty, and the return of the covenant community to a position of political self-determination in their own land. None of that happened. When the exiles returned under Cyrus, they returned not as a restored kingdom but as a Persian province called Yehud Medinata. They had a governor appointed by Persia. They paid taxes to Persia. They operated within the administrative structure of the Persian imperial system. The Davidic royal line did not return to the throne. There was no king of Judah issuing decrees, commanding armies, or conducting independent foreign policy. The community rebuilt its temple and re-established its religious practices, which was enormously significant in cultural and spiritual terms. But it was not what the prophets had promised when they described restoration. The kingdom was not restored, and it would not be restored, not under the Persians, not under Alexander the Great, not under the Ptolemies or Seleucids who divided Alexander's empire. There was a brief period of Jewish political independence under the Hasmonean dynasty following the Maccabean revolt of the 2nd century BC. But even that was not the Davidic restoration the prophets described. And by the 1st century of the Common Era, Judea was a Roman province, its population under the authority of Roman governors and client kings approved by Rome. This is where the case becomes particularly revealing, because the failure of the 70-year prophecy to deliver actual political restoration generated a remarkable theological response, one that Leon Festinger's 20th century research on cognitive dissonance would have recognized immediately. When a specific prediction fails to materialize as promised, communities of sincere believers rarely abandon the prediction. They reinterpret it. They extend it. They find ways to preserve the authority of the prophetic source while accommodating the uncomfortable fact that what was promised did not arrive on schedule. In the case of Jeremiah's 70 years, this reinterpretation appears in the book of Daniel, writing in the 2nd century BC. The author of Daniel chapter 9 presents a vision in which the angel Gabriel explains that Jeremiah's 70 years were actually 70 weeks of years. That is, 70 multiplied by 7, producing a period of 490 years. This transformation of Jeremiah's plain numerical statement into a symbolic unit requiring multiplication is presented as a divine clarification, a deeper layer of meaning hidden within the original prophecy. But notice precisely what the Daniel reinterpretation does. It takes a falsifiable claim, 70 years, a specific and measurable period, and converts it into a flexible framework that can be adjusted, subdivided, and applied to multiple subsequent events across an extended historical span. The 70 weeks of Daniel have been interpreted by different scholarly and theological traditions to end at points ranging from the Maccabean period to the 1st century of the Common Era to dates still in the future. A prophecy that was once anchored to a specific number has been transformed into an interpretive framework capacious enough to absorb almost any subsequent history. That transformation is not a fulfillment. It is a coping mechanism, and it has a precise parallel in the modern study of prophetic communities. Festinger's landmark research on a 20th century doomsday group, documented in his book When Prophecy Fails, found that when a predicted apocalyptic event did not occur on the announced date, the group's response was not dissolution, but intensification. They became more committed, not less, and began generating reinterpretations that explained the failure as itself meaningful. The pattern Festinger identified in a small Midwestern American group in the 1950s is the same pattern visible in Daniel's reinterpretation of Jeremiah in the 2nd century BC. Failed predictions do not destroy prophetic communities. They generate new theology. What the 70-year case adds to our cumulative picture is something specific and important. Every previous case we have examined involved a prophecy that failed because the predicted events simply did not occur. Tyre was not destroyed. Egypt was not desolated. The Nile did not dry up. The virgin birth sign belonged to a different historical moment. The Jeremiah case is different in a subtle but significant way. Here, some of what was predicted did occur. Exiles did return. A temple was rebuilt. The timeline, measured in a particular way, does roughly align. And yet, the central promise, the restoration of the kingdom, the return of sovereignty, the reestablishment of the Davidic line, failed completely. This partial fulfillment is in some ways more instructive than outright failure, because it demonstrates exactly how prophetic interpretation preserves institutional credibility across the gap between promise and reality. You acknowledge the parts that worked. You quietly set aside the parts that did not. You build your apologetics around the alignment between the 70-year number and the temple dedication date. And you do not linger on the Persian governor still collecting taxes from the returned community. The technique is ancient. It is sophisticated, and it has been extraordinarily effective. But the gap it papers over is real. The kingdom was promised. The kingdom did not come. No amount of calendar mathematics changes that fundamental fact. Let us be precise about something before we enter this final case file. Because precision matters enormously here, and imprecision has done enormous damage to honest conversation about this subject. The question we are examining is not whether Jesus was a significant historical figure. He almost certainly was. It is not whether his teachings contain wisdom worth engaging seriously. Many people, across many traditions, think they do. It is not even whether something spiritually meaningful happened in 1st century Judea that generated a movement powerful enough to reshape the entire Western world. Clearly something did. The question, the specific, investigative, historically grounded question this case demands, is whether Jesus fulfilled the prophetic criteria that the Hebrew scriptural tradition had established for identifying the Messiah. And that question has an answer that does not require faith, theology, or any particular religious commitment to evaluate. It requires only reading the prophetic texts carefully and comparing what they describe to what the historical record shows actually happened during and after Jesus' lifetime. When you do that comparison honestly, without the filter of theological investment in a particular outcome, the result is clear. On the criteria the prophets actually established, the checklist is largely unchecked. And the reason most Jews in the 1st century did not accept Jesus as Messiah was not stubbornness, blindness, or hard-heartedness. It was that they were reading the same texts we are about to read, and they noticed the same gaps we are about to notice. The Hebrew prophetic tradition built up, across several centuries and multiple prophetic voices, a remarkably coherent picture of what the coming Davidic king, the Messiah, the Anointed One, would accomplish. Isaiah described a ruler on whose shoulders government would rest, bringing endless peace and establishing justice and righteousness from that time onward and forever. Jeremiah promised a righteous branch from David's line, who would reign wisely and do justice and righteousness in the land, during whose reign Judah would be saved and Israel would live in safety. Ezekiel described a covenant of peace, a reunited kingdom of Israel and Judah under a single Davidic shepherd, dwelling securely in their land, with their enemies subdued. Zechariah described a king coming to Jerusalem, triumphant and victorious, whose dominion would extend from sea to sea and to the ends of the earth. Micah, as we examined in the previous case, described a ruler who would deliver Israel when foreign powers invaded. These descriptions share a consistent core. The Messiah would be a political and military figure. He would restore the national sovereignty of Israel. He would defeat or subdue the enemies surrounding the covenant community. He would establish actual, observable, historically verifiable justice and peace in the physical world. not in a spiritual realm invisible to human perception, not in a future age accessible only through faith, but on earth, in history, in ways that surrounding nations would recognize and acknowledge. This is not a reading imposed on the texts by skeptics looking for ammunition. It is the reading that Jewish communities in the first century, steeped in these scriptures from childhood, naturally and reasonably derived from the plain language of their own prophetic tradition. Now examine what actually happened during and after the lifetime of Jesus. When Jesus was born, Judea was a client kingdom operating under Roman imperial authority. Its king, a figure approved and controlled by Rome. When Jesus died, approximately 30 years later, Judea was still under Roman imperial authority, now administered directly by a Roman governor. Rome had not been defeated. Roman legions had not been driven from the land. The Davidic kingdom had not been restored. Justice and peace had not been established in any historically observable sense. In fact, the period of Jesus' ministry was marked by escalating tension between the Jewish population and Roman authority. Tension that would culminate in catastrophic violence just decades later. The temple, the sacred center of the covenant community. The building whose continued existence was intimately connected to prophetic promises about restoration, was destroyed by Roman forces in 70 AD. Roughly 40 years after the crucifixion, Jerusalem was sacked. Jewish communities were scattered across the empire in what historians call the beginning of the diaspora. Everything the prophets had described the Messiah coming to prevent: enemy domination, temple destruction, national dispersal, the collapse of the covenant community's hold on its land, happened anyway. In the generation immediately following the life of the person claimed to have fulfilled the Messianic prophecies, the gap between what the prophets promised and what the historical record delivered is not a matter of subtle theological dispute. It is visible, documented, and enormous. Christianity's answer to this gap is the doctrine of the two comings. Jesus' first arrival was spiritual in nature. He came to deal with sin, death, and humanity's broken relationship with God through his death and resurrection. The political, military, and earthly dimensions of the Messianic prophecies, the defeated enemies, the restored kingdom, the universal peace, will be fulfilled at his second coming, which remains in the future. This theological framework is enormously important to Christian doctrine, and it has provided billions of people across 2 millennia with a meaningful framework for understanding human history and their place within it. But from a strictly historical and textual standpoint, it faces a fundamental problem that honest engagement requires acknowledging. The prophets did not describe two comings. They described one figure accomplishing a coherent set of tasks within a single historical appearance. There is no passage in Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, or Zechariah that says the Messiah will arrive, fail to establish the kingdom, disappear from history for an indefinite period measured in millennia, and then return to complete the original assignment. That narrative structure does not appear in the source material. It was developed after the fact, by communities processing the gap between their messianic expectations and the historical reality of what Jesus' life and death had produced. The two comings doctrine is, from a historical perspective, precisely what the Daniel reinterpretation of Jeremiah's 70 years was: a sophisticated theological response to a prophetic prediction that did not unfold as the original text described. It is an explanation built around a failure. Dressed in the language of deeper revelation, Jewish readers of the first century, applying the same textual analysis they applied to every prophetic claim, looked at the Messianic checklist and looked at the historical record and concluded that the criteria had not been met. They were not wrong to reach that conclusion. They were reading carefully. They were doing what Spinoza would later systematize, comparing the claim to the evidence and following where the comparison led. The fact that they paid for that honest assessment with centuries of persecution by communities who had reached a different conclusion is itself one of the more troubling chapters in the history of religious institutions managing the gap between prophetic promise and historical reality. There is a dimension of this case that deserves direct attention because it is almost never framed honestly in popular discussions of messianic prophecy. The criteria for identifying the Messiah were not invented by skeptics after the fact to make Jesus look inadequate. They were established by the prophetic tradition itself, preserved and transmitted by the rabbinic community, and applied consistently to every figure in the first century who attracted messianic expectations. And there were several. Jesus was not the only person in first-century Judea around whom messianic hopes gathered. Simon bar Kokhba, who led the major Jewish revolt against Rome in the 2nd century, was initially endorsed as a potential Messiah by Rabbi Akiva, one of the most respected scholars of the period. Bar Kokhba was evaluated against the same prophetic checklist when he died in military defeat and the revolt was crushed. The messianic candidacy ended. No doctrine of a second coming was developed to explain why the kingdom had not been established. The conclusion was simply that the criteria had not been met, and the search continued. This pattern, evaluating messianic candidates against the prophetic standard and declining to retrofit the standard when candidates fail, represents the intellectually consistent application of the same investigative logic we have been applying throughout this entire series of case files. The prophets made specific claims. History provides specific evidence. The comparison between claim and evidence determines the outcome. What makes the Christian case distinctive is not that it offers better evidence of fulfillment. It is that it developed an interpretive framework sophisticated enough to defer the unfulfilled portions of the prophecy indefinitely into the future, making them permanently immune to historical falsification. A Messiah who will complete the job at some unspecified future date cannot be proven wrong, but he also cannot, by the standards of the prophets who described the job, be proven right. Pull back for a moment from the individual case files and look at what we have accumulated across this entire investigation. 8 separate prophetic texts. 9 distinct claims, examined against the historical record using the same basic method Baruch Spinoza developed in a rented room in 17th century Amsterdam. The method that got him excommunicated, nearly stabbed, professionally destroyed, and ultimately killed at 44 by a lung disease contracted from the only work his persecutors had left him. Tyre still stands as a Lebanese city of over 100,000 people, not the bare rock where fishermen spread nets. Egypt was never emptied of its human and animal population for 40 years. The archaeological record of continuous occupation runs unbroken, straight through the period when total desolation was supposed to reign. The Nile has never dried up. Not for a season. Not for a year. Not for any measurable period in the thousands of years of recorded human observation along its banks. Rachel's prophecy was already fulfilled by returning Babylonian exiles, before Matthew borrowed it for a massacre that Josephus, the most thorough chronicler of Herodian atrocities in existence, never recorded. God's decree of a 120-year maximum lifespan was violated immediately and repeatedly by the very patriarchs whose genealogies appear in the surrounding chapters. The sign to King Ahaz named a child Emmanuel, a name Jesus never carried. Bethlehem required a Roman census mechanism that did not function the way Luke describes it functioning. Jeremiah's 70-year promise delivered a return of exiles, but not a restoration of the kingdom. And the messianic prophecies that wove through Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Zechariah described a political and military transformation of the ancient world that did not materialize during or after Jesus' lifetime. 9 failures. Documented. Historical. Verifiable. And yet the institution kept going. That fact, not the failures themselves, but the institution's survival of them, is perhaps the most psychologically interesting data point in this entire investigation. How does an institution survive the failure of its central evidential claims? The answer, which social psychologists and historians of religion have documented extensively, involves a cluster of mutually reinforcing mechanisms that operate simultaneously and largely below the threshold of conscious awareness in the communities they protect. The first mechanism is authority compression, the concentration of interpretive power in a class of specialists whose qualifications include not just knowledge of the texts, but institutional credentialing that makes their readings automatically more legitimate than the readings of ordinary people. When a farmer in 4th century Antioch noticed that the Nile had not dried up and asked his bishop why Isaiah said it would, the bishop did not say the prophecy failed. He said the farmer lacked the theological training to understand what the prophecy meant. The gap between the prediction and reality was not evidence of prophetic failure. It was evidence of the farmer's interpretive inadequacy. This mechanism is extraordinarily robust because it converts every potential falsification into a demonstration of the questioner's limitations rather than the institution's errors. The second mechanism is recontextualization, the systematic redescription of failed predictions as operating on a different level than the one the questioner is applying. Literal becomes metaphorical. Metaphorical becomes typological. Typological becomes eschatological. At each step, the falsification is absorbed by shifting the relevant domain of fulfillment further from observable historical reality and closer to frameworks that cannot be checked against evidence. A prophecy about a river drying up, when the river demonstrably has not dried up, becomes a spiritual statement about the drying up of Egypt's cultural vitality, or its agricultural productivity during a particular drought season, or its eventual diminishment relative to other civilizations. The text means something other than what it says, and what it means is always conveniently compatible with what actually happened. These two mechanisms, authority, compression, and recontextualization, have been operating continuously across the 2,000 years since these prophetic texts were written, and they have been spectacularly effective. The vast majority of people who have sat in churches and synagogues hearing these prophecies quoted as evidence of divine authorship have never been given the tools to check the claims themselves. They have been given conclusions dressed as evidence, interpretations presented as facts, and the unspoken but pervasive message that questioning the institution's readings is itself a form of spiritual failure. This is precisely what made Spinoza so dangerous, and it explains why the reaction to his work was so disproportionately violent. He did not attack religion emotionally. He did not mock believers or dismiss spiritual experience as primitive delusion. He developed a method, careful, replicably, available to anyone with access to the texts and the willingness to read them honestly, that bypassed authority compression entirely. His method did not require a bishop's permission or a rabbi's endorsement. It required only the same basic investigative logic applied to any other historical claim. Compare the prediction to the record. Check the original language. Read the surrounding context. Examine the timeline. Follow the evidence. That method, once understood, is permanently available to anyone who chooses to use it. And what it reveals, applied to the 9 cases we have examined, is not that the people who wrote these texts were stupid or malicious, or uniquely prone to error. It reveals that they were human. They were responding to immediate historical crises with the literary and theological tools available to their cultural moment. They were making predictions about events they genuinely believed were coming, driven by genuine conviction about divine activity in human history. Some of their predictions were reasonable extrapolations from the political dynamics of their era. Some were expressions of desperate hope in circumstances that offered very little rational basis for optimism. None of them, the evidence strongly suggests, were the product of supernatural foreknowledge, because supernatural foreknowledge, if it were operating, would produce a rather better track record than the one we have documented across these 9 cases. Here is the reframe that this entire investigation makes possible. And it is important to state it precisely because imprecision here does real damage. Demonstrating that specific prophecies failed is not the same thing as demonstrating that God does not exist. It is not the same thing as demonstrating that spiritual experience is illusory, that ethical wisdom found in ancient texts is worthless, or that communities of faith have contributed nothing of value to human civilization. Those are separate questions requiring separate investigations. What 9 failed prophecies demonstrate, with considerable historical force, is something much more specific and much more practically significant for people navigating their relationship with religious institutions today. They demonstrate that the claim of prophetic perfection, the assertion that these texts contain supernatural predictions verified by history, and that this verification proves divine authorship and therefore institutional authority, is not supported by the evidence. The authority claim built on prophetic fulfillment is not valid, because the fulfillments, examined carefully, are not there. and that matters enormously. Because that authority claim is precisely what institutions have used to demand obedience, suppress questioning, punish dissent, and convince generations of sincere people that their own honest doubts were spiritual failures rather than rational responses to genuine problems in the evidence. Spinoza recognized this. He recognized that the institution's authority claim and the actual content of the texts were two separate things, and that dismantling the first did not require abandoning the second. You could read these ancient human documents honestly, acknowledge their errors and their failures, appreciate their genuine wisdom and their genuine beauty, and still pursue whatever relationship with the divine your own honest investigation led you toward. What you could not do, what intellectual honesty would not allow, was pretend the failures were not there.